The screaming started at exactly 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know because I was watching the clock on Mom's kitchen wall, counting down the minutes until I could escape back to my room. But escape wasn't an option anymore. Look at yourself, Diana. Mom's voice cracked with embarrassment and rage. 30 years old, wearing clothes from thrift stores, driving that piece of junk car, living in our spare room like some kind of homeless person, Dad finished coldly from the doorway. You're living like a homeless person and embarrassing us. I sat quietly at their kitchen table, still wearing my favorite flannel shirt and jeans that I'd bought for $12 at the Salvation Army. To them, I looked like failure incarnate. To me, I looked comfortable. The Hendersons asked about you yesterday, Mom continued, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. They wanted to know why our daughter dresses like she shops in dumpsters and drives a car that belongs in a junkyard. My car was a 2007 Honda Civic with 247,000 miles on it. It ran perfectly, got excellent gas mileage, and had been with me through 4 years of college and 6 years of building my business. I loved that car. What did you tell them? I asked quietly. What could I tell them? That our daughter is 30 years old and has nothing to show for her life? That she works some mysterious job she never talks about and lives like she's broke? Dad stepped into the kitchen, his face red with frustration. Your brother just bought his second house. Your sister's kids are in private school. And you look like you can't afford a decent meal. I could afford a lot more than a decent meal, but I'd learned long ago that my family wasn't interested in hearing about my work. Every time I tried to explain what I did, they'd glazed over and changed the subject to Marcus's promotion or Jessica's new BMW. We've been patient, Mom said, stopping her pacing to stare at me. We've let you live here rent-free for 2 years while you figure out your life. But enough is enough. I pay rent, I said quietly. $500 a month is not rent in this neighborhood. It's charity. She wasn't wrong. Market rate for a room in their upscale apartment complex was closer to $2,800 a month. But I'd been paying exactly what they asked for, no questions asked. You're 30 years old, Dad repeated, like my age was evidence of some moral failing. Your cousin Jennifer just made partner at her law firm. Your high school friend Katie owns 3 restaurants. And you, what do you even do for work? I run a consulting business. Consulting, Mom scoffed. For who? People who need advice on how to live in poverty. I'd been consulting for Fortune 500 companies on digital transformation and data architecture for 8 years. My clients included 3 companies in the Fortune 10, 2 major banks, and a tech giant everyone in this room used daily. But explaining that would require them to listen, and they'd made it clear they weren't interested in listening. This ends tonight, Dad announced with finality. You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things and find somewhere else to live. You're kicking me out? We're helping you grow up, Mom corrected. Maybe when you're forced to take care of yourself, you'll finally get a real job and start dressing like an adult. I looked around the kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 2 years. The same kitchen where they'd celebrated Marcus's promotion to VP and Jessica's engagement to a surgeon, while barely acknowledging my presence at the table. Can I have until the weekend to find a place? Tomorrow morning, Dad repeated firmly. I'm changing the locks tomorrow night. That evening, I lay in their spare room listening to them discuss my failures through the thin walls. How I was wasting my potential. How embarrassing it was to have a daughter who looked homeless. How they'd failed as parents because I hadn't turned out successful like my siblings. The next morning, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. 30 years of life condensed into 3 containers. Mom watched from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disappointment and determination. This is for your own good, she said as I loaded my car. Sometimes people need tough love to reach their potential. I walked to my car with a small suitcase, feeling their eyes on me from the window. Dad had already called a locksmith. I could see the van pulling into the parking lot as I drove away. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that I owned their entire apartment complex. I'd bought Meridian Heights through my holding company Sterling Properties 3 years ago. It was a struggling property with high vacancy rates and deferred maintenance. I'd purchased it for $12.3 million, spent another $4 million on renovations, and turned it into one of the most desirable residential complexes in the city. My parents lived in Unit 4B. Market rate, $4,200 per month. Their actual rent, thanks to the family discount I'd built into the system, $1,800 per month. They thought they'd gotten lucky with a rent-controlled apartment. They had no idea their landlord was eating $2,400 monthly losses to keep them comfortable. I drove to my real home, a modest 3-bedroom house I'd bought outright 4 years ago in a quiet neighborhood across town. Nothing fancy, nothing that would impress anyone, but it was mine. Completely paid off, no mortgage, no landlord, no family drama. My phone rang as I was unpacking. My property manager, Janet. Diana, I just got a call from the tenants in 4B. They want to add another person to the lease. A son who's moving back home. Marcus. Of course. What did you tell them? That any lease modifications need approval from ownership. Should I send them the paperwork? I thought about Mom's face this morning. Her certainty that she was teaching me a lesson about real life and responsibility. Actually, Janet, let's schedule a property inspection for Unit 4B. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Is there a maintenance issue? Just a routine inspection. And Janet? Wear your official Sterling Properties uniform. Make sure they know you represent the ownership group. The next morning, I sat in my car across the street from Meridian Heights at 8:55 a.m. Through my binoculars, I could see Mom tidying up the apartment, probably annoyed that the property management company was interrupting her routine. At exactly 9 a.m. Janet knocked on their door. I watched Dad answer, saw him gesture Janet inside. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could imagine it. My phone rang 15 minutes later. Diana, this is fascinating. The tenants had no idea who actually owned the building. When I mentioned that Sterling Properties had acquired it 3 years ago, the woman asked if she could meet with ownership about her son moving in. What did you tell her? That the owner prefers to remain private, but I could pass along any requests. She seemed stressed about something. Kept asking questions about the ownership group, the purchase history, that sort of thing. I could picture Mom's face as the timeline clicked into place. 3 years ago. Right when I'd supposedly started my mysterious consulting job, that she'd never believed was real. Schedule a meeting for this afternoon. Conference room at the Sterling Properties office. Tell them the ownership group will consider their lease modification request in person. At 3 p.m. I sat at the head of the conference table in our downtown office, wearing my only business suit and trying not to smile. Janet had briefed them that the ownership representative would review their case personally. Mom and Dad walked into the conference room looking nervous and slightly confused. They dressed up for the occasion, Dad in his good suit, Mom in her church dress. They still had no idea. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I said formally, not looking up from the file in front of me. Please have a seat. I heard Mom's sharp intake of breath. Dad's chair scraped against the floor as he sat down heavily. Diana. Mom's voice came out as barely a whisper. I looked up with the same expression I used for difficult client meetings. Professional. Detached. Completely in control. I understand you'd like to modify your lease to add an additional occupant to Unit 4B. Dad found his voice. You own our building? Sterling Properties owns your building. I own Sterling Properties. I opened their file, spreading the documents across the table. Along with 4 other residential properties and a commercial complex downtown. Mom was staring at me like I'd materialized from thin air. But your clothes. Your car. You lived in our spare room. I lived in your spare room because you asked me to, and I paid the rent you requested. As for my clothes and car, I dress and drive according to my preferences, not other people's expectations. How long? Dad asked. How long have you owned our apartment? 3 years. I purchased the property when the previous owners were facing foreclosure. It was hemorrhaging money due to deferred maintenance and poor management. I pulled out the renovation receipts, the occupancy reports, the financial statements that showed Meridian Heights transforming from a failing property into a profitable investment. The building was 60% vacant when I bought it. It's now 97% occupied with a waiting list. Property values in the complex have increased by 40%. Mom's hands were shaking. You've been our landlord for 3 years? Technically yes. Though I've been subsidizing your rent significantly. Market rate for your unit is $4,200 per month. You've been paying $1,800. Why? Dad asked. Why didn't you tell us? I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. Because you never asked. In 2 years of living in your spare room, you never once asked for details about my work. You assumed I was unsuccessful because I didn't fit your definition of success. But the consulting business is real. Sterling Properties Consulting. We help property investors identify undervalued assets and optimize their portfolios. Last year's revenue was $3.2 million. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. So about this lease modification, I continued. Your son Marcus wants to move in. Mom nodded numbly. Market rate for a 2-bedroom unit with an additional occupant would be $4,800 per month, plus a $500 deposit for the third person. We can't afford that, Dad said quickly. I know. Your current lease expires in 6 months anyway. I pulled out a new document. I'm prepared to offer you a choice. I slid 2 lease agreements across the table. Option 1, standard market rate lease. $4,800 per month, no family discount. You'll be treated like any other tenant. Mom picked up the document with trembling hands. Option 2, family lease. $2,200 per month, which covers the building's actual costs for your unit. No profit margin for me, but no loss either. What's the catch? Dad asked suspiciously. No catch. But I want something in return. What? An apology. Not for kicking me out, that was actually liberating. But for 30 years of assuming I was a failure without ever bothering to learn what I was actually doing with my life. Mom burst into tears. Oh Diana. I'm so sorry. We were so wrong about everything. You weren't wrong about everything. You were right that I dress simply and drive an old car. You just assumed those choices meant I was poor rather than practical. Dad reached across the table. Can you forgive us? I looked at my parents, really looked at them, for the first time in years. They seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the realization that their assumptions had been so completely wrong. I can forgive you. But I need you to understand something. Success isn't just about looking successful. I own 5 properties worth a combined $47 million. I have clients who pay me more per month than most people make in a year. I've built a business that employs 12 people and generates millions in revenue. And we treated you like a charity case, Mom whispered. You treated me according to your perception of my worth. Which tells me a lot about how you measure human value. I stood up, smoothing down my thrift store blazer that had cost me $8 and had served me well through dozens of client meetings. Take the weekend to think about the lease options. Let Janet know your decision by Monday. As they filed out, still stunned, Dad turned back. Diana, that car of yours gets 42 miles per gallon and has never needed major repairs. It's the most reliable car I've ever owned. He smiled sadly. I guess we have a lot to learn about you. That evening I sat in my paid-off house, looking through the financial reports for all my properties. Meridian Heights was performing better than ever. The commercial complex had just signed 2 new tenants. The consulting business had 3 new clients starting next month. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. We choose option 2. And Diana? We'd like to take you to dinner this weekend. To really talk this time. I typed back, I'd like that. But I'm picking the restaurant. Somewhere with good food that doesn't care how you dress. She responded with a crying laughing emoji, and for the first time in years, I believed we might actually understand each other. The next morning I put on my favorite flannel shirt, got in my beloved Honda Civic, and drove to the Sterling Properties office to review portfolios and plan acquisitions. Some people dress for the job they want. I'd always dressed for the life I wanted, comfortable, authentic, and completely unburdened by other people's expectations. Turns out that approach had worked out pretty well.